Man denies first-class seat to black soldier. What she does next will shock you. The weight of her service medals felt heavier than usual as Sergeant Leah Matthews stared at her first-class boarding pass. 6 months in Afghanistan had taught her about survival, but nothing had prepared her for what awaited on Flight 237 to Chicago. The businessman's cold stare and curled lip spoke volumes before he even opened his mouth. "There must be some mistake," he said, voice dripping with disdain. "This is first class." Little did either of them know that this encounter would unravel a decade-old military scandal and change both their lives forever. Hey, beautiful people, before we dive into this powerful story, drop a like and let us know where you're watching from. Your engagement means the world to us. Ready? Let's witness something extraordinary. The morning sun cast long shadows across Arlington National Cemetery as Sergeant Leah Matthews stood before her brother Michael's grave. The polished granite headstone read, "Lieutenant Michael Matthews, 1990-2019, Bronze Star Medal." Her fingers traced the engraved letters, a ritual she'd performed countless times before deployment. "I made it back, Mike," she whispered, "just like I promised." Growing up in South Chicago, the Matthews siblings had been inseparable. Their mother, Sarah, a high school teacher, had raised them alone after their father's death in a construction accident. Despite the hardships, Sarah had instilled in them an unwavering sense of duty and compassion. "Your character is your legacy," she would often say, her voice firm but gentle. Michael had blazed the trail, enlisting right after high school. Leah followed 3 years later, despite her mother's tearful protests. "One child in harm's way is enough," Sarah had pleaded. But Leah saw how proud Michael's service made their mother, even through her worry. The photograph of him in his dress uniform still held the place of honor on their living room wall. What the photograph didn't show was the discrimination Michael faced. Despite his exemplary service record and tactical brilliance, his promotion to captain had been mysteriously denied. The official explanation cited insufficient leadership experience. But Michael had confided in Leah about the sideways glances and the whispered comments, the opportunities that somehow always went to others. "The uniform doesn't change how some people see us," he'd told her during their last video call. "But we serve anyway, because it's not about them. It's about what's right." 2 weeks later, Michael was gone. The official report cited enemy action, but rumors circulated about faulty equipment. Sarah had aged a decade overnight, her hair turning gray at the temples. She'd planted a small garden in Michael's memory, tending it with the same care she'd once lavished on her children. Leah excelled in her own military career, earning her sergeant stripes through a combination of tactical skill and natural leadership. Like Michael, she faced subtle resistance, training exercises where she was mysteriously left out, commendations that were delayed or lost in paperwork, comments about affirmative action whispered just loud enough to hear. But Leah had learned from Michael's example. She worked twice as hard, stayed twice as long, and never gave them the satisfaction of seeing her crack. Her unit in Afghanistan had learned to respect her after she led them through a devastating ambush, keeping her cool under heavy fire and ensuring everyone made it back alive. The ceremony awarding her the Silver Star had been bittersweet. As she stood at attention, Leah couldn't help but think of Michael, who deserved similar recognition but never received it. Her mother sat in the front row, pride and pain warring in her eyes. Now, kneeling before Michael's grave, Leah adjusted her dress uniform. They're finally sending me home, big brother. Mom's probably got enough food prepared to feed the whole neighborhood." She smiled, remembering Michael's legendary appetite. "I wish," her voice caught, "I wish you could be there." A warm breeze rustled the rows of American flags planted among the headstones. In the distance, a bugler began playing taps, the mournful notes floating across the hallowed ground. Leah stood, brushing grass from her knees, and rendered a final salute. As she walked back to her car, her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Safe travels, baby. Michael would be so proud." Leah swallowed hard, squaring her shoulders. She had a plane to catch, a first-class ticket courtesy of a military upgrade program. After 6 months in combat zones, she was looking forward to a comfortable flight home. Little did she know that this flight would set in motion events that would finally bring the truth about Michael's death to light and force her to confront questions of justice, forgiveness, and the true meaning of service. Colonel David Richardson straightened his Brooks Brothers tie, a ritual born from 30 years of military discipline. From his corner office at Richardson Defense Consulting, downtown Chicago, sprawled out beneath him like a battlefield map. At 62, he still maintained the rigid posture and stern demeanor that had made him both respected and feared during his time at the Pentagon. On his desk, beside contracts worth millions, sat a silver frame. The photo showed 2 young men in dress uniforms, David and his younger brother James, both smiling at a military ball 15 years ago. It was taken 3 months before James's final deployment to Afghanistan, before everything changed. "Sir," his assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, "your flight to Chicago is confirmed, first class on flight 237. David acknowledged with a curt "thank you." His eyes lingered on James's face in the photograph. The same photo was displayed at Arlington, beneath which lay an empty casket. James's body had never been recovered from that mountainside in Afghanistan, lost to faulty equipment that should have protected him. The official investigation had ruled it equipment failure under extreme conditions, but David knew better. He'd spent years in military procurement, had seen the corners cut, the contracts awarded to lowest bidders with political connections. But by the time he'd gathered enough evidence, the trail had gone cold and the responsible parties had moved on to cushy private sector jobs. That failure haunted him more than the memories of his own combat tours. As the older brother, he'd always protected James. Their father, General William Richardson, had expected nothing less. Richardson's "lead from the front," he'd drilled into them. But David hadn't been there when James needed him most. A guilt had hardened him over the years, calcifying into a rigid worldview where everything was black and white, right and wrong. His decisions as head of personnel review had reflected this, including his controversial denial of a captain's promotion to a promising young lieutenant named Michael Matthews. "Insufficient experience," he had written in the rejection, though the real reason had more to do with the lieutenant's vocal criticism of military equipment practices. David had seen it as insubordination rather than legitimate concern. Now, years later, that decision sat uneasily in his conscience. David checked his Rolex, a gift from James, and began gathering his things. The meeting with defense contractors in Chicago couldn't wait. As he reached for his briefcase, his hand brushed against a sealed envelope he'd carried for years but never opened. James's final letter home. "Read it when you're ready to hear the truth," the military courier had said. But David had never been ready, preferring to cling to his version of his brother's legacy. The familiar pain in his chest returned, sharper lately. accompanied by fatigue he couldn't shake. The doctor's words from last week's checkup echoed. Stage 4, 6 months at best. Need to get your affairs in order. He hadn't told anyone yet. Richardson's handled their problems alone. His father had taught him that much. Besides, there was still work to be done, wrongs to be righted. Though time was running out. His car service was waiting outside, ready to take him to O'Hare. Another meeting, another city, another day of maintaining the facade while his world quietly crumbled. At least he'd have a comfortable flight in first class, one of the few perks he still allowed himself. As he rolled down the elevator, David straightened his tie again, armoring himself against a world that seemed increasingly foreign. He was a man out of time, clinging to principles that others called outdated or worse. But principles were all he had left. Little did he know that Flight 237 would force him to confront everything he thought he believed in, and that a young sergeant in dress uniform would shatter his carefully constructed worldview, leading him to truths he'd spent years avoiding. The first-class cabin of Flight 237 gleamed with polished surfaces and leather seats. As Sergeant Leah Matthews stowed her military-issue backpack in the overhead compartment, she felt the familiar weight of others' stares. Her dress uniform, pristine despite 18 hours of travel, marked her as different. "Welcome aboard, Sergeant," the flight attendant Emily Parker smiled warmly. "Thank you for your service. Seat 2A is yours, best view on the plane." Leah nodded gratefully, settling into the wide leather seat. After months of transport planes and helicopter rides, the plush comfort felt almost foreign. She closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment of peace. "Excuse me," the voice cut through her moment of tranquility like a knife. "There must be some mistake." Leah opened her eyes to find an older man in an expensive suit looming over her, his lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. Behind him, other first-class passengers watched with barely concealed interest. "No mistake," Sir Leah replied evenly, reaching for her boarding pass. "Seat 2A. David Richardson, though Leah didn't know his name yet, examined her boarding pass with exaggerated scrutiny. "This is first class," he said, as if explaining something to a child. "Military personnel typically fly coach." The cabin temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Emily stepped forward, professional smile firmly in place. "Is there a problem here?" "Indeed there is." David's voice rose slightly. "I've been flying first class for 30 years. I know the usual demographics." The pause spoke volumes. Several phones emerged from other passengers, anticipating drama. Leah felt her chest tighten, remembering similar moments throughout her career. Michael's voice echoed in her memory, "Your reaction is your legacy, little sister." Sir Emily interjected, "Sergeant Matthews' ticket is valid. The airline frequently upgrades military personnel as a gesture of appreciation for their service." David's face flushed. "Appreciation? I served 30 years in the Pentagon. My brother died in Afghanistan. Now we're handing out first-class tickets like participation trophies." The words hit Leah like physical blows. She thought of Michael, of countless others who'd given everything for a country that still questioned their worth. Something inside her shifted. "With all due respect," Sir Leah stood, her voice quiet but firm, "your service doesn't give you the right to question mine. Your brother's sacrifice doesn't diminish what others have given. This uniform represents everyone who's served regardless of their background." A heavy silence fell over the cabin. David's jaw worked soundlessly, his face a storm of emotions. Other passengers shifted uncomfortably. From several rows back, an elderly man in a Vietnam veteran's cap spoke up. "Let the sergeant be, son. We all bleed the same color in combat." David turned sharply, perhaps ready to argue, when something unexpected happened. His hand went to his chest, face paling. He stumbled slightly, catching himself on the seat. Without hesitation, Leah stepped forward, supporting him. "Sir? Do you need medical assistance?" For a moment, their eyes met. Something flickered in David's gaze, recognition perhaps, or shame. He straightened, waving off her help. "I'm fine," he muttered, but the fight had left his voice. Emily intervened smoothly. "Mr. Richardson, your seat is 4C. Let me assist you." As David moved to his seat, Leah became aware of phones recording, of whispered conversations. This would probably be online before they took off. Another viral moment of confrontation. But she felt no satisfaction, only a deep weariness. An older woman across the aisle leaned over. "My husband was Air Force," she whispered. "He would have been proud of how you handled that." Leah managed a small smile, but her mind was elsewhere. Something about David Richardson nagged at her memory. The name, his mention of the Pentagon and Afghanistan, pieces of a puzzle she couldn't quite assemble. As the plane began its taxi, Leah pulled out her phone, sending a quick text to her mother. "Interesting start to the trip home. Don't worry if you see anything online. Love you." Behind her, she could hear David's uneven breathing, could feel his presence like a storm cloud. 6 hours to Chicago suddenly felt very long indeed. Neither of them knew that this confrontation would crack open a decade of secrets, or that the truth about both their brothers lay buried in the words of an unopened letter. At cruising altitude, Leah sat with an empty notebook open before her. Flight attendant Emily had slipped it to her with a sympathetic smile, along with a first-class hot towel she barely touched. The confrontation replayed in her mind, but it was David Richardson's mention of Afghanistan that kept echoing. Through the reflection in her window, she could see him in row 4, staring rigidly ahead, one hand still occasionally rubbing his chest. The military bearing was unmistakable, but there was something else, a haunted look she recognized from too many memorial services. She picked up her pen, then hesitated. The easy thing would be to stay silent, to let this become just another story of prejudice caught on camera. Her phone had already buzzed with messages from fellow service members who'd seen the videos surfacing online. But Michael's voice whispered in her memory, the hardest conversations are usually the most important ones. Leah began to write. "Dear Mr. Richardson, I noticed how you touched the officer's insignia pin on your lapel when you mentioned your brother. It's the same way I touch my brother Michael's dog tags, which I've carried since we lost him in Afghanistan in 2019. The loss leaves marks we can't explain to civilians, like muscle memory of pain." She paused, remembering the day she'd received Michael's effects. Among them had been a letter never sent, questioning the quality of their equipment. Words that now seemed prophetic. "You spoke of 30 years at the Pentagon. Perhaps you knew of Lieutenant Michael Matthews? His promotion to captain was denied shortly before his death. The official reason was insufficient experience, but he'd confided his concerns about equipment procurement. 3 weeks later, he was gone." The pen moved faster now, memories flowing. "I wonder if your brother faced the same challenges. Not the obvious ones, bullets and IEDs, but the quieter threats, equipment that failed, supplies that didn't arrive, concerns that went unheard because of who raised them." Turbulence shook the plane. Across the aisle, an elderly passenger gripped her armrest. Leah reached over instinctively, steadying the woman's water glass. Their eyes met, and the woman mouthed, "Thank you." Leah returned to her letter. "I've learned that courage comes in many forms. Sometimes it's running into fire to save your squad. Sometimes it's speaking truth to power. And sometimes it's admitting when our preconceptions have harmed others." She glanced back at David. He pulled out an envelope, worn and unopened, turning it over repeatedly in his hands. "Your brother died serving our country. My brother died questioning why some of us had to work twice as hard to prove our right to serve it. Both sacrifices matter. Both truths can coexist. The plane banked sunlight streaming through her window. Leah thought of all the letters she'd written from Afghanistan to her mother, to Michael's grave, to a country that still struggled to see past uniforms and skin color to the hearts beneath. I'm offering this letter not in anger, but in hope. Hope that by sharing our stories we might recognize our shared humanity. Hope that your brother and mine didn't die in vain. Hope that next time you see someone in this uniform, you'll remember that sacrifice knows no color. She signed her name and rank, then added a postscript. P.S. If you're ever ready to talk about Afghanistan, about our brothers, about what really happened, I'll listen without judgment. Sometimes sharing our burdens makes them lighter. Leah folded the letter carefully, her training making crisp edges. Emily passed by and she gestured for an envelope. What Leah couldn't know was that her words would unlock a chain of revelations that would shake the military establishment to its core, or that in her attempt to bridge one divide she would expose others far more dangerous. The truth about both their brothers lay waiting like a landmine beneath desert sand, ready to explode. Leah's courage and compassion in the face of discrimination deserves at least one thumbs up, but sadly no one has hit that like button yet. Let's change that and show her some love. David Richardson's hands trembled as he opened Leah's letter, his chest tightening in a way that had nothing to do with his recent diagnosis. The first-class cabin had grown quiet, the hum of engines providing a backdrop to his racing thoughts. The mention of Lieutenant Michael Matthews hit him like a physical blow. Of course, he remembered one of his last decisions before retirement. The young officer's file had been thick with commendations, but also with troubling reports about his aggressive questioning of equipment contracts. His brother James's unopened letter seemed to burn in his breast pocket where it had lived for years. David had always thought his silence protected James's memory. Now, reading Leah's words about her own brother, doubt crept in like a poison. Equipment that failed, supplies that didn't arrive. A memory surfaced James's last call home. Something's not right with these new vests, Dave. The guys are saying other units got different ones. Better ones. David had dismissed it as standard military grumbling. 2 weeks later, the notification team was at his door. His eyes caught a phrase in Leah's letter: both sacrifices matter. Both truths can coexist. Sweat beaded on his forehead. The cabin felt too small, too confined. He signaled Emily for water, his throat suddenly desert dry. "Are you all right, sir?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. The sergeant he managed. "What's her full name?" "Matthews. Sergeant Leah Matthews." The name struck another chord. In the chaos after James's death, there had been mention of a sergeant who'd tried to save him. The report was incomplete, key details missing. He'd been too grief-stricken to follow up. With shaking fingers, he finally opened James's last letter. The paper was yellowed, the creases well worn despite never being unfolded. "Dear Dave, if you're reading this, I guess I didn't make it. There's something you need to know. The equipment contracts you've been overseeing, they're killing us out here. Not the enemy, our own gear. Lieutenant Matthews has been trying to raise the alarm, but nobody's listening. I've gathered evidence, names, dates, serial numbers. By the time you get this, I'll have either delivered it to the Inspector General or..." The letter trailed off. David felt the floor drop out from under him. He'd denied Michael Matthews' promotion the same week James died. Had he unknowingly silenced the very person trying to prevent his brother's death? The irony was bitter enough to choke on. He looked up to see Sergeant Matthews helping an elderly passenger with her overhead bag, her movements precise and professional despite the earlier confrontation, despite his behavior. The pieces were falling into place with terrible clarity. His decades of rigid adherence to chain of command, his dismissal of complaints from certain officers, his own prejudices carefully disguised as procedure. How many other James and Michaels had paid the price? His chest tightened again, the doctor's prognosis echoing 6 months, maybe less. He'd always thought he had more time to read James's letter, to uncover the truth, to make things right. Emily appeared with his water. "Sir, you're very pale. Should I call for medical assistance?" David waved her off, but his hand was shaking so badly he nearly spilled the water. In his mind, James's voice merged with Lieutenant Matthews' official complaints, creating a damning chorus of warnings ignored. He pulled out his phone, fingers hovering over his contact list. Judge advocates, investigators, journalists, people who owed him favors, people who could help expose the truth. But would they believe him now? A dying man's confession? His gaze returned to Sergeant Matthews. Perhaps she was the key. Her brother had started this fight. Maybe she could finish it. But first, he owed her more than an apology. He owed her the truth, however ugly, however damning to his own legacy. David began to write his response, each word a weight lifting from his conscience. "Dear Sergeant Matthews, you were right about our brothers, about everything, but there's so much more you need to know. Flight 237 encountered turbulence somewhere over Pennsylvania, sending drink carts rattling and passengers clutching their armrests. During the commotion, David made his way to the empty seat beside Leah, his response letter gripped tightly in his hand. Sergeant Matthews, his voice was different now, stripped of its earlier arrogance, revealing something raw underneath. "May I?" Leah nodded, noting how he braced himself against the seats, his complexion ashen. The turbulence had settled, but he seemed to be fighting his own internal storm. "Your brother David began, then stopped. He pulled out James's letter, unfolded but barely legible through years of being carried. My brother tried to warn me about the equipment, about Lieutenant Matthews, your brother. I didn't listen. I wouldn't see." Leah's breath caught. The defective vests. Michael reported them 3 times. And I buried those reports. The confession seemed to age him a decade. I thought I was protecting the system, the chain of command. James paid for my blindness with his life. The air between them grew heavy with unspoken grief. A flight attendant approached with drinks, but David waved her away. "There's more," he continued, voice dropping. "The day your brother died, it wasn't just faulty equipment. The entire supply chain was compromised. Contractors cutting corners, kickbacks, deliberate mislabeling of safety specifications. Michael was getting too close." Leah's hands gripped her armrests, knuckles white. "Are you saying his death wasn't an accident? The enemy fire report was fabricated. He was murdered, Sergeant. And I helped cover it up by blocking his promotion, burying his concerns." David's voice cracked, just like they did with James. 1,000 emotions warred in Leah's chest: rage, grief, vindication. The plane seemed to shrink around them, the hum of engines growing distant. "Why tell me this now?" she managed. David's hand went to his chest again, a gesture Leah was beginning to understand. "Stage 4. Aggressive. I've got months, maybe weeks. The truth dies with me unless someone carries it forward," Leah finished. He nodded. "I have names, documents, evidence I've gathered since James died. Things I was too cowardly to reveal while I still had position and power. But you have something I never had." "What's that?" Moral courage. He met her eyes directly. "You faced my prejudice with dignity, responded to hate with understanding. That letter you wrote, it broke through decades of willful blindness." The elderly passenger across the aisle coughed discreetly, reminding them they weren't alone. David lowered his voice further. "Your brother and mine died trying to expose the same corruption. Help me finish what they started. Let their deaths mean something." Leah studied him, this man who'd gone from antagonist to potential ally in the space of a flight. It won't be easy. The system protects its own. I know David's smile was grim. But I've got nothing left to lose, and you've got everything to gain. Justice for Michael. Reform that might save other soldiers. The truth. The plane banked, sunlight streaming through the windows. Leah thought of Michael's last message, sometimes the right path is the hardest one. If we do this, she said, finally we do it right. No shortcuts, no assumptions, no prejudices. The truth matters more than any individual. David extended his hand. Partners. As Leah shook it, neither could know that this alliance formed at 35,000 feet would shake the military establishment to its core, or that the evidence they'd uncover would cost one of them everything. The plane continued its journey toward Chicago, carrying two unlikely allies and enough explosive truth to change the system forever. But first, they had to survive landing. 3 weeks after Flight 237, Leah stood before a packed community center in South Chicago. The crowd was a mix of veterans, active service members, and families, many holding photos of loved ones lost to equipment failures or enemy action. My brother Michael used to say that truth is like a sunrise, she began, her voice steady. You can deny it, you can turn your back on it, but it's coming anyway. In the front row, Sarah Matthews clutched a folder of Michael's letters. Beside her sat David Richardson, noticeably thinner but eyes sharp with purpose. His presence had initially caused tension, but as Leah shared their story from confrontation to collaboration, the atmosphere shifted. We've identified 37 cases, Leah continued, clicking through slides. 37 soldiers lost due to deliberately compromised equipment. 37 families told their loved ones died fighting the enemy when the real enemy was right here at home. Photos appeared on the screen, young faces in uniform, each with a story, each with questions unanswered. The room grew heavy with collective grief and mounting anger. But we're not here just to expose truth, Leah's voice strengthened. We're here to change the system. The Veterans Equipment Safety Alliance launches today. We need your stories, your evidence, your voices. David struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on a cane. As a former Pentagon official, his voice carried decades of authority. I contributed to this broken system. I let bias and bureaucracy override justice. But standing here, looking at your faces that remind me of James, of Michael, I see my chance at redemption. A woman stood up, trembling. My husband, Staff Sergeant Thomas Parker. They said his body armor failed during an ambush, but he'd written home about equipment concerns. More stories poured forth. A mother whose daughter's helicopter crashed due to counterfeit parts. A veteran who'd lost his squad to faulty detonation devices. Each account added pieces to their growing puzzle. Emily Parker, the flight attendant from 237, had become their unofficial coordinator. She worked the room, collecting contact information, distributing pamphlets about whistleblower protection. The military community is like family, she explained when asked why a civilian was so involved. After witnessing that flight, how could I not help? Local media covered the event, though larger networks remained suspiciously quiet. David's industry contacts had warned them powerful people were watching, worried. During a break, Leah found David in a quiet corner, examining papers through reading glasses that seemed too big for his thinning face. Your mother, he said without looking up, she reminds me so much of James. That same fire for justice. She's worried about you, Leah replied. We all are. The doctor said rest, not. Rest is for people with time. He cut her off. I need to see this through. For James. For Michael. For all of them. Before Leah could respond, Emily rushed over. We've got something. A contractor from the vest manufacturer just called. Says he has internal memos proving they knew about the defects. He's willing to talk, but only in person. David's eyes lit up with familiar intensity. "Where?" "Detroit, tomorrow night." Leah felt a warning prickle at the back of her neck. "It feels too convenient." "Or it's exactly what we need," David countered. "Hard evidence from an insider. I'll go." "Not alone," Leah insisted. "We do this together, remember." The afternoon session began with practical steps, legal resources, counseling services, secure channels for sharing evidence. Sarah Matthews led a support group breakout session for families, while Emily organized a database of incidents and testimonies. But it was the final speaker who brought the room to silence. Captain Rachel Martinez, current Pentagon staff, risking her career to speak. "I served with Lieutenant Matthews," she began. His concerns about equipment weren't unique. What was unique was his persistence. The week before his death, he told me he'd found a pattern. Companies winning contracts despite failing safety tests. Inspection reports altered. Money flowing to offshore accounts. She pulled out a thumb drive. "This contains every report Michael filed, every email, every test result. I've kept it safe, waiting for the right moment. That moment is now." The room erupted. David seized the thumb drive like a lifeline while Leah steadied her mother, who had begun to weep. As the event wound down, Leah watched the impromptu groups forming, families sharing stories, veterans offering support, journalists scribbling notes. Something powerful was taking shape, something that transcended rank and race and politics. But danger was growing too. David's phone buzzed constantly with warnings from old contacts. Leah's military superiors had summoned her for routine reviews. Even Emily reported strange men asking questions at her airline. They were poking a very dangerous bear, and it was starting to notice. Later, as they secured the evidence in a safe deposit box, David turned to Leah. "Detroit could be a trap." "Probably," as she agreed. "But if there's any chance those memos exist, we have to try." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "If something happens to me." "Nothing's going to happen," Leah interrupted firmly. "If it does," he persisted, "everything I know is in a sealed envelope with my lawyer. The whole story. But it only gets opened if." Leah understood. Dead man switch insurance against interference. As they left the bank, neither noticed the black SUV parked across the street, nor the camera lens tracking their movements. The trap was already set, but not in Detroit. The truth about their brothers was closer than they knew, and far more explosive than they imagined. The Detroit meeting never happened. At 3 a.m., Leah's phone lit up with a text from David. "Turn on the news." The contractor who'd promised to meet them was dead. Single vehicle accident on a clear night, empty road. The timing wasn't subtle, it wasn't meant to be. It was a message. In her small apartment, surrounded by case files and Michael's letters, Leah felt the weight of what they'd started. Her phone buzzed again. "Emily. They suspended me today. Random drug test came back positive. I haven't touched drugs in my life." The pieces were moving against them. But David had anticipated this. Within hours, the Washington Post received an anonymous data dump, internal emails, inspection reports, contract modifications, enough to spark preliminary questions, not enough to prove conspiracy. A warning shot. Captain Martinez called next, voice tight with urgency. "They're cleaning house. My security clearance is under routine review, but I found something in Michael's old files. A location. Storage facility in Arlington, Unit 237. The unit number wasn't coincidence. Leah remembered Michael's last letter. "If anything happens, remember our lucky number." She'd thought he meant his old football jersey. David insisted on coming to Arlington despite his deteriorating health. James mentioned the same facility, he explained, showing her his brother's final letter. Said he'd hidden proof there. The storage facility was unremarkable rows of identical red doors under flickering fluorescent lights. Unit 237's lock had been changed recently, but Sarah Matthews had taught her children more than just moral courage. Leah's hands moved with practiced efficiency. Inside, disappointment. Empty except for a single filing cabinet, its drawers hanging open and cleared. They were too late. But David noticed something. The floor, a section of concrete, sounded hollow and tapped. 20 minutes of careful work revealed a hidden compartment containing a waterproof case. Inside, a laptop, external drives, and a letter addressed to whoever finds the truth. The letter, in Michael's handwriting, revealed a pattern more sinister than individual corruption, a systematic scheme to profit from soldier deaths through insurance fraud. Defective equipment wasn't just about cutting corners, it was designed to fail in combat situations. "They're betting against our survival," Leah whispered, horror dawning. "Every soldier deployed with their equipment." "Is worth more dead than alive," David finished. His face had gone gray. James discovered the same thing. That's why. The storage facility's lights suddenly went out. Footsteps echoed on concrete. Leah moved instinctively, pushing David behind the filing cabinet. Her combat training kicked in as she assessed exits, angles, cover. Two men appeared in the doorway, silhouettes against emergency lighting. Military stance, civilian clothes. Colonel Richardson, one called out. "Let's make this easy. Walk away. Enjoy your remaining time with family. The pension stays, the medical care continues." David's breath came in sharp gasps. Leah could feel his heart racing as she pressed him further into cover. And Sergeant Matthews, the second man, added, "Your brother died a hero. Don't tarnish his memory with conspiracies. Think of your mother." The threat was clear. Leah's hand found the case with Michael's evidence. One chance. She pitched her voice to echo Michael and James died for profit. "How many more families will you destroy?" The men advanced slowly, confident in the darkness. But Leah had spent months in Afghan nights. Darkness was an ally. "Last chance," the first man warned. "This ends tonight." Yes, Leah agreed. It does. What happened next would be debated in closed hearings for months. The official report cited inconclusive security footage and conflicting witness statements. What's certain, when emergency responders arrived, they found two unconscious men with military IDs, a missing laptop, and David Richardson in cardiac distress. But Leah and the evidence were gone. Hours later, in a secure location Emily had prepared, Leah began uploading files to secure servers worldwide. David, against medical advice, worked beside her, decoding names and connections from his Pentagon days. "There's a Senate oversight hearing next week," he said between labored breaths. "Every major defense contractor will testify about equipment standards." "We'll need more than files," Leah responded. "We need witnesses, survivors." David's phone lit up with a message from his lawyer package received. "Standing by." The dead man's switch was set. Now they just had to stay alive long enough to use it. As dawn broke over the city, Leah received one final text from an unknown number parking garage. "West End, level B2, midnight. Bring the truth about 237. The number sequence 237 appeared again. But this time it felt different, not a unit number or flight code. "February 3rd, 2007, David breathed. The day both our brothers." The trap was obvious, but so was the opportunity. In a private hospital room across town, Judge Advocate General Colonel Sandra Hayes reviewed the preliminary evidence. Her expression hardened with each page. "Get me SecDef," she ordered her aide, "and find out everything about Flight 237. Something bigger is coming." She had no idea how right she was. The Senate Armed Services Committee hearing room buzzed with tension. News of the leaked documents had sparked a media frenzy, forcing an emergency session. Defense contractors sat in a grim line before the senators, their lawyers hovering like anxious shadows. Leah watched from the gallery, unrecognizable in civilian clothes. David's empty seat beside her felt accusatory. He'd been rushed to intensive care hours earlier, his condition critical. Senator Elizabeth Warner, a former JAG officer, led the questioning. "Mr. Harrison," she addressed the CEO of Pinnacle Defense Solutions, "can you explain why your company's body armor, certified as meeting level IV protection, consistently failed in combat situations?" "Senator, we stand by our testing protocols." "Let me be more specific," Warner cut in, sliding forward a document. "February 3rd, 2007. 2 separate units, same equipment failure pattern. Lieutenant Michael Matthews and Sergeant James Richardson. Both reported defects, both died within weeks." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Leah's hands clenched in her lap. "That's a tragic coincidence," Harrison began. But she hesitated, smiling. "Is it?" Colonel Sandra Hayes stepped forward, her JAG uniform immaculate. "Because we have evidence suggesting these failures weren't accidents, but business strategy." She nodded to her aide, who distributed packets to the committee members. "Insurance policies taken out on high-risk deployments, offshore accounts linked to equipment certification officials, statistical analyses showing higher casualty rates precisely with substandard equipment was deployed." The contractors' faces remained impassive, but their lawyers began whispering urgently. "This is absurd," Harrison blustered. "We're a patriotic company." "A company that made billions betting on soldier deaths," a new voice rang out. Captain Rachel Martinez strode in, uniform crisp despite her recent administrative leave. "Captain, you're not on the witness list," Harrison's lawyer protested. "But I am," she placed her credentials before the committee. "As Lieutenant Matthews' direct superior, I received his final report, a report that mysteriously vanished after his death." Martinez turned to face the contractors directly. "He found your formula, didn't he? How you calculated acceptable losses against insurance payouts? How you manipulated deployment patterns to maximize equipment failures in high-intensity combat zones?" The gallery erupted. Photographers' cameras clicked rapidly. Harrison's face had gone from red to purple. "This is slander! Oh, well, I demand a "You demand nothing." Senator Warner's voice cut like steel. "Colonel Hayes, continue." Hayes approached the witness table, laying out photos. "These are the faces of your formula. Sons, daughters, brothers, sisters. Each death carefully calculated for maximum profit." In the back of the room, the door opened and heads turned as David Richardson was wheeled in, oxygen tank at his side. Despite his obvious weakness, his voice carried decades of command authority. "I served this country for 30 years, he began. "I let myself believe in a system that valued protocol over truth, profit over lives. My brother died because of that belief. Lieutenant Matthews died trying to expose it." He gestured weakly, and Leah moved to his side, finally revealing herself. The contractor's lawyers immediately began objecting. "Sergeant Matthews has no standing." "Actually," Colonel Hayes interrupted, "she does, as does every service member who was issued compromised equipment. But more importantly, the doors opened again. Uniformed soldiers filed in, dozens. Then hundreds. Family members, too, each holding photographs. The gallery overflowed as they filled the aisles, silent witnesses to corruption's cost. They all have standing, Hayes finished. Harrison's composure finally cracked. You can't prove any of this. Records are lost, witnesses are... Dead? Leah stepped forward. Like the contractor in Detroit, the safety inspector in Phoenix, the quality control manager in Tampa? She nodded to Martinez, who activated a screen. James's final video testimony played, his voice strong despite the grainy footage. If you're seeing this, they got to me, but they couldn't get to everything. Check Unit 2037, check the insurance policies, follow the money, and remember, we swore to defend against all enemies, foreign and domestic. The video switched to Michael's hidden camera footage of a meeting with Harrison himself discussing acceptable failure rates and risk management strategies. The contractor's CEO slumped in his chair as his lawyer frantically whispered in his ear, but it was too late. Senator Warner leaned forward. Mr. Harrison, given this evidence, would you like to revise your testimony? Before he could answer, David's oxygen monitor began beeping urgently. Medical personnel rushed forward as he clutched his chest. Get everything, he gasped to Leah. All of it. No deals. As they wheeled him out, his voice echoed, remember 237. The hearing erupted into chaos. But in the confusion, no one noticed Harrison's security chief slip away, phone to ear. Or the subtle nod between defense contractor lawyers. They had contingency plans for moments like this, plans that would be set in motion within hours. The truth about Unit 2037 was still waiting to be discovered, and it would change everything. While David fought for his life in intensive care, Leah discovered the real meaning of 237, and it shattered everything she thought she knew. The numbers weren't a unit, flight, or date. They were a project code, Operation 237, a classified initiative to test experimental armor in active combat zones without soldier consent. Michael and James hadn't just discovered corruption, they'd uncovered sanctioned murder. In David's hospital room, surrounded by beeping monitors, Leah shared her findings. They selected units with high minority representation. Her voice trembled with rage. They called it optimizing demographic variables. David's face, gaunt from illness, crumpled with shame. I signed those orders. They buried the demographics in bureaucratic language. I never questioned, never wanted to see. Before he could continue, Colonel Hayes burst in, face ashen. They're burning everything, every facility connected to 237. Accidental fires, server crashes, they're erasing the evidence. But James and Michael had planned for this. The hidden laptop contained one final file, coordinates, 5 locations, 5 buried caches of evidence. Dead man's insurance, David whispered. James always said, create multiple targets. A nurse entered to check David's vitals, but Hayes stopped her at the door. ID first. Since the hearing, security had tightened. There had already been 2 attempts to access David's room by fake medical staff. As they planned their next move, Leah's phone buzzed. A text from Emily. Sarah found more of Michael's letters. You need to see this now. At her mother's house, Sarah waited with a shoebox of letters. I never read them, she admitted. After he died, it hurt too much. But today, the letters revealed a devastating truth. Michael hadn't discovered Project 237. He'd been deliberately assigned to it. His promotion denial wasn't random. David's signature on that order had sealed his fate. They needed him gone. Sarah's voice broke. My boy was marked for death the moment he started asking questions. Leah felt the world tilt. David hadn't just failed to prevent Michael's death, he'd been an unwitting instrument of it. Racing back to the hospital, she found David's room empty. A nurse reported he'd checked himself out against medical advice. She found him in the hospital chapel, kneeling despite his weakness. "I knew you'd find the truth eventually," he said without turning. "That's why I chose your flight. Why I provoked you. I needed someone who wouldn't stop digging." "You knew?" Leah's voice cracked. "All this time?" "Not at first. But after reading James's letter, I started remembering details. Meetings with certain names were emphasized. Orders, I was told, were routine. I didn't connect it until I saw your brother's name on that promotion list." He turned, tears streaming down his face. "I killed them both, Leah. James, by not listening. Michael, by following orders without question. My prejudice, my blind obedience. I have so much blood on my hands." Leah stood frozen, combat instinct warring with raw emotion. This man had helped kill her brother. Yet he was also dying to expose the truth. "Tell me now." "Because tonight's the real 237th meeting, the one they've been waiting for. Top brass, contractors, everybody who managed the program. They're gathering to coordinate their cover-up." He handed her a phone with a calendar entry in an address. "How did you?" "I was invited. They still think I'm protecting the system. It's why they let me live this long." He coughed violently. "My lawyer has everything. If I don't call him by midnight, it all goes public. But that's not enough. They need to be caught in the act." Leah studied the man before her. Once an enemy, then an ally, now something impossibly complicated. "You're not coming, are you?" "Can't," he smiled sadly. "Doctor says I won't last the night. Besides, they'll be watching me. But they don't know about the letters yet. Don't know you've figured it out." He gripped her hand with surprising strength. "In this, Sergeant. For Michael. For James. For all of them." As if summoned by his words, Colonel Hayes appeared in the doorway with Captain Martinez. "We've got a tactical team standing by. And something else. The nurse who tried to access his room earlier, she talked, gave us the whole operation plan for tonight." David nodded in satisfaction. "If the pieces are in place, now go. Let an old man pray for forgiveness." Leah hesitated, decades of military training battling with personal feelings. Finally, she snapped to attention and saluted. "Thank you for your service, Colonel." Shaking hands with the receptionist, who groaned at the slow-paced turnmite. His return salute was perfect, despite his weakness. As she turned to leave, he called out, "Sergeant Matthews, I was wrong that day on the plane. The uniform never looked finer than it does on you." Hours later, as Leah geared up with Hayes' tactical team, her phone lit up with a final text. "David Richardson, time of death 21:37. Even in death, he'd left them a message. The operation would begin at 9:37 p.m. Friends, if this story of courage, redemption, and justice touched your heart, we'd be honored to have you join our community. Hit that subscribe button to support more powerful storytelling like Sergeant Matthews' journey. Together, we can give voice to untold stories that matter. In the quiet hours before midnight, David Richardson dictated his final testimony from his hospital bed. He detailed 20 years of systematic corruption, naming names, outlining the architecture of death that Project 237 had become. The cancer had spread aggressively, but his mind remained razor-sharp, determined to leave nothing unsaid. "Make sure Sergeant Matthews gets this," he told his lawyer, handing over a worn photograph. It showed two young lieutenants, James Richardson and Michael Matthews, standing together at officer training school. On the back, a note in James's handwriting, "Some bonds transcend rank and race. Remember that, big brother." The doctor had given him hours, maybe minutes. The morphine made his thoughts drift, but he fought to stay lucid. They'd found 5 more families affected by Project 237 that morning alone. Black and Hispanic soldiers, disproportionately assigned to units testing experimental equipment. His own signature on so many death warrants, hidden in bureaucratic paperwork. Emily brought him reports from their growing network of whistleblowers, insurance documents, test results, deployment orders, all pointing to a conspiracy larger than anyone had imagined. Military contractors hadn't just profited from deaths, they'd engineered them, playing odds with lives, betting against survival rates in minority units. "Your brother," he told Emily, his voice barely a whisper, "he saved 3 men the day he died. The official record was altered to hide that. Leah needs to know he was a hero. They both were." The pain intensified as evening approached. Nurses offered stronger meditation, but he refused. "Need to finish this," he insisted, though each word cost him. His confession ran to hundreds of pages, each one a step toward redemption. As he wrote about Michael's final report, his heart monitor began to spike. The words blurred before him. The Lieutenant Matthews identified critical flaws in Project 237's testing protocol. Recommendation, immediate suspension of deployment. The same report he'd dismissed as insubordination years ago. Time was running out. David could feel it in his failing body, but there was one last piece to put in place. He reached for his phone, dialing a number he had memorized decades ago. "General?" he said to the answering machine. "It's Richardson about Project 237. I remember everything. Midnight, the usual place. Come alone." The trap was set. His part was nearly done. Now it was up to Leah to finish what their brothers had started. As darkness fell, David Richardson closed his eyes for the last time, the weight of secrets finally lifting from his shoulders. Across town, Leah and Colonel Hayes' team raced against both time and a system designed to protect itself. 5 caches of evidence, 5 locations, and multiple teams of unknown operatives trying to destroy them first. The coordinates from James's laptop led them through a deadly scavenger hunt, where each piece revealed new layers of corruption. Sarah Matthews had joined the operation from a secure location, coordinating with Emily to track suspicious movements around each site. Mother's intuition, she called it, but her tactical insights proved invaluable. She'd spent years piecing together Michael's last days. Now those details were saving lives. The first cache was already compromised. A gas leak had conveniently destroyed an entire storage facility. But they reached the second in time, finding hard drives concealed within old equipment. The third contained personnel files, each death marked with the same code, 237, protocol implemented. Captain Martinez's team secured the 4th location just as unmarked vans approached. The firefight was brief but intense, leaving 3 private security contractors in custody. The 5th cache proved the most damning. Video evidence of deliberate equipment tampering, with dates and serial numbers matching soldiers' deaths. But as they assembled the evidence, Leah noticed a pattern. These weren't just random assignments. Units with the highest minority representation were consistently given the compromised gear. The demographic data was deliberately buried in dense reports, hidden behind euphemisms like specialized testing groups and targeted deployment strategies. Time was running out. David's dead man switch would activate at midnight, releasing everything to the press. But they needed the architects of Project 237 in custody before they could disappear behind layers of bureaucratic protection. The gathering David had mentioned was their only chance. Colonel Hayes' phone buzzed continuously with updates from field teams, 2 more attempts on David's hospital room, 3 accidental fires at evidence storage facilities, a junior officer who'd agreed to testify found dead in apparent suicide. The system was cleaning house. Emily's airline contacts reported multiple private jets fueled and waiting at regional airports. The conspirators were preparing to flee. But Sarah Matthews had taught her children well. The truth always finds its way to light. Tonight, that light would finally shine on Project 237. As the team geared up for the final raid, Leah received one last message from David's lawyer. He's gone. His final words, "Tell Leah, sometimes the weight of the uniform isn't bullets, but the truth we choose to carry." She squared her shoulders, checking her tactical gear. The truth had cost both their brothers' lives. Tonight, it would buy justice. The midnight raid on the Alexandria Officers Club revealed Project 237's darkest secrets. As tactical teams breached the historic building, they found over 24 high-ranking officials and contractors huddled around documents and laptops. General Marcus Wright, the program's architect, stood mid-sentence at a podium, his presentation slide displaying casualty statistics by demographic groups. The evidence was damning beyond their worst fears. Project 237 wasn't just about defective equipment, it was a decades-long social engineering program. Combat units were carefully selected based on racial composition, with minority-heavy units deliberately assigned compromised gear. Insurance policies were structured to maximize payouts for expected losses, with bonuses tied to casualty rates. The real shot came when they uncovered James Richardson's final report. He hadn't died in combat. He'd been executed after confronting Wright about the program. The same day, Michael Matthews had emailed evidence to multiple secure addresses. Both deaths were ordered within hours of each other, their units deliberately sent into an ambush with faulty equipment. Colonel Hayes found a hidden vault containing Project 237's complete archives. Performance reports showed systematic discrimination. Minority officers who questioned equipment standards were flagged for enhanced testing deployment. Their units received the worst gear, their deaths classified as combat losses, their families given carefully scripted explanations. As they processed the scene, Captain Martinez discovered a laptop still logged into the project's secure server. Live feeds showed current deployments, dozens of units still using compromised equipment. Emergency recalls were issued, but for some the warning would come too late. The most devastating revelation came from Wright himself. Under questioning, he revealed that David Richardson had discovered the truth years ago. His aggressive denial of Michael Matthews' promotion was an attempt to protect his brother James, a deal with Wright that ultimately failed. Both brothers died because David chose system loyalty over truth. Sarah Matthews arrived as they were processing evidence, having insisted on being there. When she saw Michael's name on the targeted deployment lists, her quiet dignity cracked. "They didn't just kill him," she whispered. "They hunted him, like all the others." The room fell silent as decades of manufactured tragedy sank in. Leah found herself in the club's trophy room, surrounded by photographs of graduating classes. One showed Michael and James together at officer training school, arms around each other's shoulders. On the back, a final message in James's handwriting: "If you're reading this, the truth is finally out. We died trying to save others. Make it mean something." The Pentagon press room erupted in chaos as Colonel Hayes presented the evidence. Live cameras broadcasted evidence of Project 237 to a stunned nation. Families of lost soldiers filled the seats, each holding photographs of their loved ones. Sarah Matthews stood at the podium, Michael's posthumously awarded Medal of Honor gleaming on her chest, her voice unwavering as she read names of the fallen. Capitol Hill announced immediate hearings. Contractors' stocks plummeted as arrest warrants were issued. Insurance companies faced massive fraud investigations. The military establishment, rocked by the scandal, began a comprehensive review of all equipment protocols. General Wright and his conspirators faced charges of murder, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. The vindication came too late for some. David Richardson was buried with full military honors, his final confession transforming him from conspirator to key whistleblower. James and Michael were reinterred at Arlington's prominent section, their sacrifice finally acknowledged. The ceremony drew thousands, including many soldiers who'd survived thanks to their warning. Emily's Airline established a foundation for affected families, funded by the massive insurance settlements. Captain Martinez took command of a new oversight division, ensuring equipment testing reflected real combat conditions across all demographics. A military procurement underwent complete restructuring, with transparent protocols and independent verification. Media coverage focused on the human cost. Hundreds of minority soldiers deliberately placed at risk, families deceived, careers destroyed to protect profits. Each revelation brought new lawsuits, new investigations, new reforms. The system that had protected itself for so long was being dismantled piece by piece. Sarah Matthews addressed Congress, her testimony helping pass the Military Equipment Safety and Accountability Act, nicknamed Michael's Law. Legislation established strict oversight, whistleblower protections, and severe penalties for discrimination in military procurement. A memorial wall at the Pentagon listed names of Project 237's victims, a permanent reminder of institutional betrayal and the cost of silence. Leah found her own vindication in the changes she witnessed. Young officers approached her at Michael's grave, sharing stories of equipment concerns now being taken seriously. The culture was shifting, slowly but surely. Even old guard commanders who'd once dismissed such complaints now listened carefully, remembering Project 237's lessons. The final evidence cache revealed one last surprise. A joint letter from Michael and James, describing their friendship and shared commitment to justice. "We knew exposing this might cost our lives," they wrote, "but staying silent would cost our souls. To whoever finds this, carry the truth forward. Make sure our uniform stands for protection, not profit. Make sure our deaths light the way for change." 5 years after Project 237's exposure, its legacy continued to reshape military culture. The Matthews Richardson Center for Military Ethics opened at West Point, its mission carved in granite: truth above rank, justice above protocol. David's entire fortune, along with billions in settlement money, funded scholarships for minorities in military service and support for whistleblower families. Sarah Matthews became a powerful advocate for military reform, her quiet strength commanding attention in Pentagon briefings and congressional hearings. The garden she'd planted for Michael now flourished as a community memorial where veterans gathered to share stories and heal. Each spring, flowers bloomed in the colors of units affected by Project 237, a living testament to loss and renewal. Emily's airline whistleblower program expanded into a national network, protecting those who dared expose corruption. Captain Martinez, now Colonel Martinez, led a transformed equipment testing division where diversity wasn't just welcomed but required. Her teams developed new safety protocols that saved countless lives, each success honoring Michael and James's sacrifice. The ripple effects reached beyond the military. Corporations faced stricter oversight, insurance fraud regulations tightened, and procurement processes became transparent. The term 237 entered the lexicon as shorthand for institutional discrimination, a cautionary tale taught in service academies and business schools alike. David's final testimony became required reading for officer training. His journey from unwitting enabler to crucial whistleblower illustrated the complex moral challenges of modern military service. The chapel where he'd made his confession to Leah became an unofficial pilgrimage site where officers contemplated their own ethical boundaries. The evidence caches yielded one final gift, a joint research project Michael and James had started, detailing cost-effective ways to improve equipment safety across all units. Their work, completed by a new generation of officers, revolutionized protective gear design. Lives saved by these innovations became known as 237 survivors, turning a number of shame into a symbol of progress. General Wright and his conspirators received life sentences, their trials exposing decades of systematic discrimination. But the true punishment was historical. Their names became synonymous with betrayal of the uniform, while Michael and James were honored as pioneers of military reform. Their story, taught at service academies, showed how moral courage could overcome institutional corruption. As Sarah tended her memorial garden, now part of the larger healing center for military families, she often spoke of legacy. "My son and James didn't die for profits," she'd say. "They died for change. And look around, change is growing here, in every flower, every life saved, every truth spoken without fear." A decade after Flight 237, Leah Matthews stood before a new class of cadets at West Point, her general stars catching the morning light. The lecture hall had been renamed the Matthews Richardson Auditorium, but she still found it surreal seeing her brother's name alongside David's, their story now woven into military doctrine. Time had transformed the scandal into systematic change. Every piece of military equipment now carried a 237 compliance certification, requiring transparent testing across all demographic groups. The old power structures had crumbled, replaced by oversight systems that valued truth over tradition, lives over profits. Michael and James's dream of an equitable military had become reality. Sarah Matthews, now in her 70s, still received letters from soldiers' families. Each shared stories of lives saved by improved equipment, of careers protected by new whistleblower laws, of truths spoken without fear of reprisal. She'd created a foundation supporting military families affected by discrimination, turning grief into action. Emily had become a powerful advocate for corporate accountability. Her airline's whistleblower program a model for industries nationwide. The flight attendant who'd witnessed that first confrontation now trained others to recognize and report ethical violations. Flight 227 was studied in business schools as a turning point in corporate responsibility. Colonel Hayes, before retiring, had established the Military Ethics Review Board, ensuring no project like 237 could ever hide behind bureaucracy again. Her successors, many from minority backgrounds, brought fresh perspectives to military leadership. The changes rippled through every branch of service, breaking down decades of institutional barriers. The memorial wall at Arlington had grown into a reflection center, where James and Michael's story inspired new generations of officers. Their final letter, displayed prominently, reminded visitors that moral courage knew no rank or race. Each year, graduates placed their first salute coins there, pledging to uphold the lessons of Project 237. David Richardson's grave, once a source of controversy, became a symbol of redemption. Officers struggling with ethical dilemmas would visit, leaving handwritten promises to choose truth over comfort, justice over protocol. His confession, published posthumously, helped other whistleblowers find their voice. As Leah concluded her lecture, a cadet asked about that day on Flight 237, the confrontation that started everything. "It wasn't about a seat," she explained. "It was about seeing truth, even when it hurts. About standing firm when standing alone. Most importantly, it was about understanding that real change requires both courage to fight and compassion to forgive." Outside, the spring sun illuminated the parade ground where new officers would soon take their oath. In the memorial garden, fresh flowers bloomed around a simple plaque. "To all who dare speak truth to power, your courage lights the way. Remember 237. The legacy lived on not in scandal, but in countless small acts of moral courage, each adding another chapter to a story that had changed everything. The end. Dear friends, Sergeant Matthews' story of courage and justice has touched us deeply. If this tale of redemption moved you too, please support our star-tailing team by hitting that subscribe button and sharing this video with your loved ones. Your likes and comments fuel our passion to bring more powerful stories to light. We'd love to hear your thoughts below. What touched you most? Which moment brought tears to your eyes? How did David's redemption affect you? And here's a question. Should we explore part 2 with Leah's continued fight for military reform? Let us know in the comments. Together, we can keep these important stories alive.